Right. Well, good evening, everyone, or whatever time of the world it may be where you are joining us from. My name is Don Giberson, and I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the Nanaimo Climate Action Hub Society to this, our fourth workshop in the Forward Nanaimo 22 series. Forward Nanaimo 22 is an invitation for people to come together and learn about key issues that are of concern to us in our local neighborhoods, and that could be key issues in the upcoming municipal elections in the fall this year. I'd like to start by acknowledging that long before there was a Canada or a British Columbia, the Coast Salish people lived on and stewarded these lands. The regional district of Nanaimo is situated on the traditional territories of the Snuneymuxw, Stanaas, Stamanis, Qualicum, Hupachisath, and Comox First Nations. We recognize the historical and ongoing injustices perpetrated by the colonial system against Indigenous peoples. We also understand that living and working on these lands means that we have a responsibility not only to strive for meaningful nation-to-nation relationships between our colonial governments and First Nations, but also to care for and protect the land, water, and air that we all rely on. As a guest on these lands and as a member of the Nanaimo Climate Action Hub, it is my sincere hope that our work will contribute positively towards these goals. This is the fourth and final workshop in our series, Forward Nanaimo 22. This one is on climate action and care for the environment. And we had three previous workshops on strengthening our food system, safe and affordable housing, and building a local donut economy. Our format tonight is a fairly simple one. We will have two presenters, each talking about the topic of climate action and care for the environment. And then we will have a couple of breakout rooms where people will have an opportunity to offer their ideas and suggestions on what we can do locally to address that very topic. Before we begin, I just want to mention briefly a couple of Zoom logistics. We would recommend possibly going with a speaker view that would allow you to see the speaker and their slides when they are presenting. And we are recording this program, so if you do not wish to be recorded, we would invite you to have your camera off and to just keep that in mind. And if there are no other important details around Zoom, I believe we are ready to begin. So I would like to start by introducing our very first presenter, Deb Morrison. Dr. Deb Morrison works in research, practice, and policy partnerships from her community as a learning scientist, locally as an elected official for the Islands Trust, and internationally as a research and independent non-government organization observer at the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Deb draws on an eclectic range of justice theory to inform her work in the world and foster her continued journey for transformative liberation. She is involved in climate justice, education, environmental learning, empowerment policy, and works across Canada, the United States, and the world. Deb, we are thrilled to have you joining us tonight, and we extend a warm Nanaimo welcome to you, and I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. So I apologize, I'm recovering from a terrible cold, which was apparently not COVID, but I am hopefully hearable. Can everyone hear me well? Okay, I will try to keep this volume. So I'm going to go ahead and share slides. I did put the link to my slides that are available online. I put the link in the chat window. You are welcome to copy that link and just maintain it. There is a wealth of resources in the notes section of the slides. So, and I encourage people to take and use any of the slides. They're open resource slides. So please feel free to use them as you feel fit. As was described, I am a member of the Islands Trust, an elected official here for North Pender. I'll come to my territorial acknowledgement here in a second, but I do want to name that I'm not here as a representative of the Islands Trust in terms of the whole organization. I'm going to speak to my own experiences as a representative here and as the chair of the Trust Programs Committee. And I will also speak to you from my position as I started a new company called Clear Environmental last year because I was super bored during COVID. And so, it's a catch-all for all this other work that was just described and that you'll hear a little bit about. Just needed some way to do it. So, all right, I go by Deb too. Dr. Morrison it is my title formally, but I don't use it hardly ever. So when thinking about climate action and care for the environment, I think about how we mobilize for that, right? So how do we actually get all of society doing it, and how do we do it in a just way, both how we mobilize and what we mobilize toward. So I want to kind of touch on those points as we go here. All right. So I'm down here in North Pender Island, which is named Stayas in the Sinchatan language. I'm very grateful to live and work on the Wasanich territories, traditional and unceded and current. There's a lot of information here about the Wasanich and about the tribes in the region. Please do look it up and learn a little bit more about the region that we live in. It's an amazing space and it has been stewarded since time immemorial. There's also some resources in the note section about UNDRIP, if you're not familiar with it, which is the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And it's what the DRIPA, which is the BC law, comes from. And we're going to get back to DRIPA in a second. So there's some resources there to learn and make yourself familiar with that. It's not very long to read it. It's really good to read it. I quote it regularly when I'm arguing with people like Transport Canada. Okay, so super helpful to read it. All right. So I always like to ground us in the fact that we live on a globe. We live on a finite sphere. And because we live on a finite sphere, I'm happy to hear that you talked about donut economics, because exponential growth or any type of growth is not possible on a sphere. There is a point at which we actually have to rethink how that is. Otherwise, growth is done on other people's back. And so we need to actually really be careful about how we think about the economy, how we think about how we externalize pollution that somebody else had mentioned here earlier. So as we engage in climate action, we also have to think about the fact that we can't always deal with things at a global level because that's so far away from our accountability structures, from our relationships with each other, that we have to be working on a more local level like you are in the region. And there's a paper that I put in the chat or in the notes section of the slides. It's called The Power of 10. And it's about different scales of population. And it basically says that there's a sweet spot somewhere in the middle of population that you want to work at. And like the Nanaimo regional area is about the right size for the sweet spot. So it's because you have accountability to each other. You can go over and knock on somebody's door when they're not doing the thing you need and be like, hey. And so it fosters cooperative engagement, cooperative action. Mostly. Of course, sometimes we get into conflict, but we can work through that because we're going to be here in this space together. All right, so a couple considerations as we think about this. And I was trying to frame my comments tonight based on the question of what is Nanaimo doing well and what could you be doing differently or better in terms of climate action and care for the environment. All right. And I have had a look at the report and it's wonderful. Like the things that are the aspirations that you have in the plan, they're wonderful. So the question is, how do you implement it, really? And so these are the core questions that you need to think about as you engage in implementation. So who's involved at every step of the process? Bringing somebody in at the very end and assuming that they're just going to take it is not going to work. So who's involved at every step of the process? How are you managing for equitable decision-making? I'm Dr. Morrison. I walk into a room with somebody who's 17 years old and a high school student. There's a power differential. I have to acknowledge that. We have to figure out how that 17-year-old can contribute just as much as me because they have a lot to contribute. And so how is it that we balance those power dynamics as we make decisions? And then how are people in the system learning about issues and possibilities? And the system being the whole of your regional district, really, and the whole of the city of Nanaimo. Because everyone in your community has to be learning as you go. Otherwise, you're going to have tensions as people start to rub against, why are we changing? This is too radical. And we'll talk about that in the Islands Trust example. So you really want to be thinking constantly about how you're bringing everyone with you on the decisions you're making, and not just bringing them with you on your decisions and the way you want it to move, but really involving them in the decision-making process, because sometimes the decisions you're making are not going to be the just and equitable decision. There's a better one if we ground it in community and if we ground it in diversity in our communities. So really, really thinking of community members as assets, as resources in the work together. And then the last one is, how are inequitable impacts of action or inaction being taken into account? We often get stuck on the inequitable impacts of action, and we fail to recognize that inaction is an action. So it's important that as we weigh how we're going to do things, that we really think it through with all different members of society, and that we also acknowledge that the fact that we haven't done anything yet is itself a problem. Like we are in a social dilemma right now. So to make this all really concrete, I thought I'd give a few quick examples. One last thing I wanted to name here. I'm a learning scientist. I just have to quote Barbara Rogoff. So Barbara Rogoff talks about learning as participation, as shifts in participation or transformation of participation. And so what we're really trying to go for as we think about climate action is not just getting everyone to change their actions, but getting them to learn why they need those actions changed so that they're sustainable, right? And not even just that they're sustainable, but that people are so invested in that shift that they start innovating and emerging all sorts of new options of how to be and be sustainably in the world. So to do that, we really need to engage people in the work while we do it. So it doesn't matter if you don't know all the details as you're starting to engage in building new transportation systems, or you're starting to design affordable housing initiatives, or whatever it is. It just matters that you're all in the room thinking together, working, learning together. Those experts, whoever they are, they're learning with community, because community has a lot of knowledge. And so really thinking about participation and action together. As we do that, so a couple examples of that. In the Islands Trust area, we have in 2000 and in 2000 and what was it, 19? Boy, COVID has totally changed the flow of time. In 2019, I was a co-writer with Scott Colburn from Gabriola for the climate change emergency motion for the Islands Trust area. And that got passed unanimously in March of 2019. And then what has happened since is we've developed a series of things, both in community and in the Islands Trust, that are helping people learn and shift and change. And so one of them was a series of place-based education efforts called Islands Trust Stewardship Education. And so they were all across the islands around issues that were identified by islanders as needed knowledge. So this one was on rainwater harvesting. There was a range of them. And so we used expert informed. There was people from universities, government agencies, local knowledge was brought into play. And then people were encouraged to think about like how they could take actions related to what they're learning. And it was very sort of place oriented for the trust. This particular one, I wouldn't say was as intergenerational, but it's very good if you can make it intergenerational. The other example that's up here was something that was done with Fire Smart Saturna, started it, and then all of the Southern Gulf Islands Fire Smart programs got involved. And they asked me to design a series of webinars about wildfire and climate change. And that was in 2020. And we did it, even though it kicked in with COVID, we still did it because it was all done virtually. So, and it was multi-island. I think we went all the way up to Gabriola. I think Gabriola got involved. And so all of the islands south of there, including some of the very small ones, all got involved. And we pulled knowledge from all of those different fire departments and Fire Smart programs and shared out what people are doing. And it was incredible. I learned so much about the possibilities that for climate change resilience and adaptation. And we also brought in experts from all over the place around like fire management and like, not just wildfire fighting, but actually like prevention, a whole ton of prevention issues. So, and data sets about how fast and the projections of drying and heat in the islands. And so our concern is that our winter temperatures are changing quite a lot. And so we're not getting the cooling that we normally would in these southern islands, and it's drying fast. So those are examples of learning as we go, right? So we're changing a lot of policies as we move along, but we're also trying to reach into community and ask, like, what are the best solutions? How do we get those moving at a community level? What are the roadblocks that we hit policy-wise at different levels of government? Because down here we have like 18, I'm never sure, layers of government. And so we need to really think through, like, how do we make that doable? How do we figure out how to remove any barriers that are in place? We also want to think about climate justice really specifically. So I'll give you another example of a similar kind of place-based learning effort that was really justice-centered. And so I'm drawing my definition of climate justice from the Mary Robinson Foundation. She was the president of Ireland and is an international expert in climate justice. And she really talks about it as participation in decision-making processes, how we have openness to different partnerships, how we can ensure that everyone has true equitable participation, not only that they're at the table, but that the power dynamics are managed in such a way that they really have voice at the table and decision-making authority. And so if we look at that, there's a number of principles that came out of that, some called the Bali principles, and I've linked to them. I've also linked to a brief that I wrote for the UN that's around this whole sort of area. So there's a few readings that if you're interested in this area, you can dig into a little bit more. So the example, oh, I included this too, sorry about that, last minute addition. This is an effort created, Learning in Place is an effort created by Megan Bang, Dr. Megan Bang, who worked for a long time in Washington State with tribal nations. She herself is Indigenous. And the thing that I really like that I've linked to in the slides is around community-based learning, but she provided some fabulous everyday definitions of race, racialization, colonization, and settler colonialism, which are really helpful. They're in like a one-page brief that you can just share with people so that you're on common ground for terminology. Because sometimes it's really intimidating for people to even like get into the area of justice because they don't know enough. They're worried about being white, about being a settler colonial. Like, we need to work through that. And like how we do that is we educate ourselves with high quality resources. So these framework documents that Megan's produced are fabulous for doing that. The program is actually an elementary based learning program to go outside and take kids into the environment. And so it's interesting to explore, but these frameworks can be used for anyone. All right, the local effort that we did here on Pender, this was actually, we got in 3 weeks of courses just before COVID hit. And it was called Kakaches Project. And the idea is that we worked with the Wasanish First Nations and really thought about what is it that they want in terms of learning, in terms of working together, being back in the islands, climate action. It was all centered around climate action. And so for them, a lot of that was about thinking and learning in place. So coming into the islands as elders, as youth, as community members, working with the island communities, learning with them, and telling stories of different scales of work. So hyper local into like a bog or a local place, all the way out to like stories of like the transnational boundary between the US and Canada and all the different First Nations in the region, thinking about the whale protection corridors. And so we involved both First Nations elders and lawyers and experts from different other non-Indigenous science traditions into the space to work together and to learn together and to listen to each other. And it was incredible. And so there's a number of different primitive sort of iterations of other projects that have come off of that, that are really thinking about building these types of sustained partnerships and relationships. And the Kakaches effort is not a single project. That was the beginning of it. It was based on a few years before a reconciliation efforts, community to community, and it is still going on. So we're just think up new things to do and write grants together. So, but that builds is showing up for the needs that the First Nation defined. And that's helping us start to think and helping, frankly, most of the Penderites really think differently and learn about like what could be possible in this area if we just shift our worldview. So very interesting and helpful, but a different pace, I think, than sometimes we take when we think about some of the city planning. So it's learning that's on a longer trajectory than some of the action planning we're doing right now. And I can't help but mention the Islands Trust policy statement. So I'll probably be briefer than necessary here, but feel free to ask questions. If you haven't heard of it, then you possibly don't listen to the news ever. So the Islands Trust policy statement has been going on for 3 years now, the renewal of the policy statement. It's the main activity of Trust Council in terms of a major project. And as chair of the Trust Programs Committee, I've been kind of shepherding it along through committee, and the executive committee is responsible for it directly. Anyway, as part of this effort, one of the things we had to do, we passed both a climate change emergency motion and a reconciliation motion at the same time in March of 2019. And then we tried to implement them all holistically into the trust policy statement. That is not a small task because the counselors, 26 counselors, also had to do the learning required to be able to really understand what those things were, right? And there was a few people that had deeper learning, but everyone can learn something as they go forward and understand those ideas. And so we started a huge amount of growth and learning and peer-to-peer learning and like small circle learning working groups where people actually dove into the topics more deeply and tried to understand what needed to be changed, why it needed to be changed, all of those kinds of things. And then all those, and the staff did the same. Staff were also learning at the same time. And then together, then we went out to community, did a whole bunch of stuff in community, took all that feedback in, went all the way through a bunch of working group meetings and created what was the draft policy statement. It was supposed to be draft 1. So at that point, it was released. It shouldn't have been, but it was released. And so now there's more community conversation on the draft, and hopefully there'll be like a much more substantial, polished draft produced before anything gets into first reading. So that's where we're at on the policy statement. There's a lot of tension around it. And so there's a lot of work trying to listen and learn and talk and be with community to explain things, to help people understand, to allay fears, because there's a lot of fear in transition. And so that's one of the biggest things that we need to focus on. I provided a few resources in a second here. Yeah, so I guess I just, before I go to the resources on emotion, really, when we hit our fear point, it's inevitable in this issue. I hit it regularly, so, and again, because the world really is on fire. And so, and I've been in the field of climate change for 30 years now, like including my 10 years in ecology. And it concerns me every day just that much more of what we're facing. And it concerns me a lot that we're having conversations about adaptation, and often mitigation is falling off the table. We can never let go of mitigation because that's the source of the problem. And so if we don't deal with the source of the problem, we're always going to be adapting and trying to deal with the ramifications. So we do need to remember that we're here on this finite planet and we're in it together. So what we learn locally, we need to share. We need to find mechanisms to share our learning with other cities that don't have the resources that we have. So think about that as you work in your space, because you've done an amazing job. And so like, what is it that you've learned that you could offer out into other communities, and what mechanisms do you have to do that? Because I think it's going to be very powerful for you to do that. I do want to point out, these are 3 of my favorite books. The All We Can Save book, I literally, like, it literally is in arm's reach all day. Okay, so it is like my favorite book by far. It's a feminist, very multi-ethnic, multiracial resource. And it has an online open educational set of resources, so helpful. They got together with a group called Generation Dread and produced a number of resources that will help you understand and work around issues of climate emotions and climate fear and despair. But also Candace Callison will help with that and think about different ways of framing things, how climate change comes to matter. But I included a book on learning here, something called We Want to Do More Than Just Survive. And this is about abolition teaching, may seem a little out of place in the climate change conversation, except in this book, it's by Bettina Love. In this book is an idea called Black joy. And Black joy is not about joy just for the sake of joy. It's about joy through collective struggle. And it's about the idea that we find hope in action, in collective action. And so that idea is the idea that I think of when I say the word hope and when I say the word joy. And I have a lot of it, even though I do hit moments of like, this is hard. So there's our sphere. Let's not forget we're on it. And I'll take any questions as we go. I know we're going to go to another speaker, I think, and then come back to questions in small groups. So I'll pause there.
All right. Well, thank you, Deb. First, for giving me 3 new books to read. I always like being introduced to new books. And no, go ahead.
Dawn, there's actually an entire list somewhere in my slide notes.
Even better.
All the climate justice books that I know of.
All right, even better. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And I would agree. I think our council has come up with a fantastic draft official community plan. There's a lot of great ideas that are being put forward. However, plans and ideas are only as effective as the ability to mobilize the community around and behind them. So I'm really thrilled that you address the topic of mobilization and how do we mobilize and what do we mobilize around? And I thought you gave us some very helpful criteria to use when doing that work. So thank you very much for your presentation.
You're welcome.
And our second presenter is Carol Ann Leishman, who is a second-term councillor for the city of Powell River. She is chair of the Powell River Climate Change Mitigation and Adaptation Committee. Notice mitigation and adaptation, Deb. She is a Powell River Youth Council coordinator, a member of the BC Municipal Climate Leadership Council, and a member of the Climate Caucus. Before being elected, she was an architectural designer, a project manager, and a built green builder for 20 years. So please join me in giving a warm Nanaimo welcome to Carol Ann Leishman.
Thank you so much, Dawn, and thank you everyone for having me. I hope you can hear me okay. And thank you, Deb, for that presentation and those resources. That was incredible, and I've decided that Deb and I are going to be best friends. So I'll just make sure I can share my screen here. It's always a bit awkward, and a couple of weeks ago I was asked to present to a social studies class at our high school, and I kept trying to share my amazing slides I put together, and I got kicked out of the meeting altogether. So hopefully that doesn't happen today. Okay, so just gonna find the right one. Share, hopefully that's the right one. Can you see my slide? Is it in? It's probably in regular mode. Okay, so I'll change it into. Okay, are you seeing? Now it's in slide or whatever you call it, slideshow.
Yes, it's in slideshow, Deb.
Okay.
Yes, it is, Caroline. Yes.
Okay, thanks so much. So I'm so happy to be here, and I think this group that you have is exactly the type of group that every community needs. These groups and need people mobilizing on climate action. I came up with the topic of my talk a little bit ago, which I will get into. So before I get going, I would very much like to give my territorial acknowledgement that I'm so grateful to live, work, and play within the traditional territory of the Tla'amin Nation peoples. They just celebrated 6 years as a self-governing treaty nation. And I was so grateful to be in attendance 6 years ago when they burned the copies of the Indian Act, which was a really incredible ceremony held out at the Nation, and we have a very close working relationship with the Nation. Our three governments, I'm this counselor at the City of Pell River, and we've had a community accord and a protocol agreement with Tla'amin Nation since actually when my mom was on council in 2003. That council was very progressive on establishing relations with Tla'amin Nation, and the three governments, the regional, we have one municipality, one main nation, and then within one regional district. So when I was on first term on council and regional district, we actually did a name change for the regional district from Pell River Regional District to Cathet Regional District, which was a name gifted to the regional district by Tla'amin elders, and Cathet means working together. So it was a very beautiful, beautiful story that I'm really happy to have been a part of. So I wanted to throw in, I have quite a bit of different slides than Deb had. Mine are a little more entertaining maybe. So I'm a bit from a science background, but from a building science background, and I do still work a full-time job actually building. I'm also a windsurfer and a kiteboarder, so I had to throw in a fun little slide because it's climate change. Some days you just don't know how you're going to get through the day. I try to have a bit of humor with it because it's very unsettling for all of us, and a lot of fear and a lot of unknowns. So just again, a little bit of humor. My topic came up recently when I constantly am sort of reminded that the status quo is so deeply embedded in local government. It's embedded within the whole corporate structure. You know, of course, our governments under the provincial and federal governments are very colonial based, and there's a lot of embedded within those systems of government. There's a lot of deep-seated status quo thinking that we have to do things the way that we've always done them. And it is like moving mountains sometimes, or it feels that way, to try to get movement and get government, even your own council, to recognize what is at stake and how serious this is. And I throw this cartoon on there because that was actually drawn about me because I brought forward the climate emergency. I wrote the motion and brought forward a memo in February of 2019, and I waved my book around. I was the chair of that meeting because I was the acting mayor in February that year and that month. And I brought a book called, I think it was called Stormy. It was something about global warming. It was quite a few years old, actually. It was global warming, stormy weather or something. And it had been my mom's book when she was on council. And I found, my mom passed away during my first term of council. And so I was just into my second term. My mom had just passed away, and I had found this book of hers on global warming. And there was a note inside it, a memo from the CAO at the time saying, hey, council, this book came across my desk and I wanted to I bought a copy for each of you and for many of the managers in City Hall, because this is dire, this is serious. And this was in like 2008, I think. And I started bawling. I was chairing the council meeting and I started bawling because it was all just too much. And anyway, the crying kind of helped get council on board with passing the climate emergency motion, but good grief. Anyway, we know here, I know I'm amongst friends, these are my people here, and we know this is not a drill. It's been a long, slow process in Pell River in our region. I started back in 2008 with we started working on a community-driven sustainability charter, which I was part of this, these massive group meetings that were complete chaos. And we finally got to the stage of adopting this sustainability charter that really started bridging the way to how do we get any traction on climate action. And then getting, before I was on council, myself and another then councillor that we ran 2 terms ago, we went on the sustainability committee. So my mom was actually the chair. I know it sounds like nepotism, but I didn't want to be on council because my mom was on there, but she was the chair, and it was a sustainability committee. So I was on that committee going before I was ever on council. And I really want to reiterate that for anyone that you know, either your organization or, you know, personally, you think they might be good on council one day, encourage them to sneak them or trick them into some way of getting onto a committee of council or regional district, because once you get on a committee, you really start to understand the mechanisms of how local government works, and you start to understand how you can be a part of that system and make change. So of course I got tricked into it, and I did the sustainability committee, and then I was like, ah, darn it, I got to run for council now. So I ran for council, got elected 2 terms ago, and then was made the chair of the sustainability committee, which when I ran last term, I changed the name after this term to the Climate Change Mitigation and Adaptation Committee, trying to be more specific to exactly what we're focused on, because I was starting to realize sustainability was kind of getting, you know, was kind of being greenwashed and overused and didn't mean as much. So we changed the name and started being a lot more specific. So we did an integrated community sustainability plan, was kind of the whole purpose of the first sustainability committee. And so that has been our kind of guiding document with actions and things. And more recently, we've done a Parks and Trails master plan with major active transportation guidelines and direction in that. And then most recently, we hired the Copenhagenized design company, which was incredible. If you haven't read the book Copenhagenized, you have to read the book Copenhagenized. It just changes everything on that European style biking infrastructure and just getting everybody out of their cars. So we had them as consultants. And so we've just completed a bicycle network strategy that's really hopefully going to transform our community into a much more safe cycling city. So my key pieces of the puzzle that I really want to highlight that have worked for our community and they really are transferable among a lot of communities. We're a relatively small community. We're 13,000 in our municipality-ish, and about 21,000 total throughout the region. We share Lasqueti Island with the Islands Trust, so we're cheating a bit there. But so the main, you know, the key pieces of the puzzle, climate champions. You have to have climate champions, whether they're, you know, on council, in the community, in the staff of the organization is so important, because that status quo will stay deeply embedded, and you will have managers coming forward and pitching that they want to buy another diesel garbage truck to pick up your organics collection, when you have a green vehicles policy and they don't even reference it. So don't even get me started on that. So also obtaining support from community organizations, so important to have that feedback to council and regional district boards, like constantly, that, you know, come on, you need to do this, you need to do that, this is where we need to go. Obviously engaging with the Indigenous communities in the region and building those strong relationships is absolutely key. And just asking what does their community need? How can we work together on that? Utilizing local citizens with relevant skills and experience. That is one of the main successful with all of our climate action, is some of the key people that signed up for our climate change committee and originally the sustainability committee, because the knowledge and the experience that was at the table. We ended up hiring one of the committee members. She had to resign from the committee because we applied for a grant, Federation of Canadian Municipalities grant, and were successful in getting 2 years full-time, 80% of the wages paid full-time for a sustainability planner. So we plucked her out of the committee. She resigned, and then she was hired, and she still to this day is our sustainability planner, and like 99% of the reason we've been able to be so successful in all the stuff we've done. And then bringing climate change up in every conversation. I pretty much bring up climate change in every single meeting and every committee meeting and it drives everybody crazy. And I know that they can't stand it, but it doesn't matter. Like constantly looking at how whatever the agenda item is, whatever the issue is, it's like climate change. And I love that Deb talked about just equity, you know, that whole piece of it is really missing. And we've been trying to bring that in, like a just transition and a, you know, looking at equity in this whole piece. And so trying to bring that into every conversation. And then of course, building capacity at the staff level. If we don't have staff dedicated to doing climate action, we are never going to get anywhere because we'll have planning staff that are not really up to speed on carbon emission reductions. They're not energy managers. Their job is not to go through the BC hydro bills and see where are we spending a lot of money on hydro because we're too inefficient. There needs to be dedicated staff, and that seems like a complete no-brainer, but like most communities our size do not have dedicated staff. It's somebody doing it off the side of their desk and some pain in the butt counselor that's micromanaging things and should just stay in her own lane. But I can't stress enough that people thinking that they don't have a voice, or there's no point in beating my head against the wall because I'm not going to be heard. I kind of, in my first term, even though we had like a slate, we had like a progressive green slate, so we had the vote. So it was like, okay, let's try to ram through as much stuff in this term as we can on climate action and, affordable housing or whatever. But still you feel that pushback, and you feel like you're not going to get anywhere. Well, beginning of second term, I was like, forget it. I'm here at the strat planning session. I want to get my climate change stuff off on the board. And there was support because, you beat it into everybody long enough. And it's like, okay, yeah, we recognize climate change is real. Okay, put it on the board. So I give hand and I'm going crazy on the board and we're all adding stuff. And then it actually became part of our strategic plan. It became our number one strategic priority, climate change adaptation and mitigation, with goals of carbon negative, emergency preparedness, and zero waste. And I couldn't even imagine a few years earlier having got that into the strat plan. So it just shows you that if you're not at the table, even on a committee, you're not going to have any effect. So you need to be at the table. Another key trick that we were successful with was during the first term, one of our counselors suggested that we put our climate action, it used to be called the CARET Fund, climate action revenue incentive program funding, and local governments get it probably every 6 months. I think they get it twice a year, dedicated money. And most communities, I think, just put it into general revenue. I think they just put it into general revenue. They don't do anything with it. We were pretty strategic first term. We created a climate action reserve fund, and it was not a non-statutory reserve. So council could just decide at any meeting, we're going to approve, $10,000 to fund that, plan or report or strategy or whatever it was towards carbon emission reduction, towards like doing a complete energy analysis of our civic facilities, doing a solar feasibility study for civic facilities, traffic, analysis, whatever it was. There was this fund building that we just tried to focus on climate action initiatives, studies, reports that would help us get grant funding. And also we hired, that's a picture of our sustainability planner, Anna, having that dedicated person who she also happens to be very good at grant writing. Then you have the plans and you have the reports and you have the studies, and then you basically have a shovel ready project, write the grant, and 9 times out of 10, you're actually successful getting the project. And the other thing is thinking outside the box and creating pilot projects. Like when you have a council that's not quite there with wanting to commit to something progressive, do a pilot project. It's been pretty successful for us. We are we're actually, other than TransLink did a small pilot on Bowen Island for on-demand transit, we're apparently the first in British Columbia to do on-demand transit. And so we did it as a pilot. There was federal, $200,000 in federal grant funding, partnered with a company called Spare Labs. They created an app, a website. We got this Zunga bus wrapped. It's incredible. Like, it's on demand. It's just like, that's the future, because we typically have these humongous large buses that drive around empty, and all the off-peak times, they're just one person on there. So we're working with BC Transit right now to actually try to build in the on-demand piece permanently into our transit system. So if anything seems like, well, let's give it a try, do it. Do a pilot project, because it's definitely the way to be like, well, we're not committing to it permanently. It's a pilot project. Very successful. so our talking to, having things in policy and in our, official community plans and stuff. I mean, even when you do get it in policy, you still have the status quo staff and management not referencing the green vehicle policy when they go and procure a garbage truck, and you end up with this diesel garbage truck. I nearly lost my mind. This was only like 2 months ago. The exact same garbage truck is available as an electric garbage truck from Mac, and it's coming out. I called Mac in Langley, and they're getting them in like June or July. Like, it's just crazy. So at least we got an electric Zamboni. So that's our electric Zamboni. And then I show a picture of City Hall because I have one of those fancy infrared cameras that I have in my day job. And I just, one night I was bored. I was like, I'm going to go see how inefficient City Hall is, because it's all single pane windows, and I know it's pretty terrible because in a windstorm you can't even talk in the council meeting because the windows are just blowing like ridiculous. And this is what City Hall looks like. So we've had sort of plans in place for a while to upgrade City Hall, but it's still, there's nobody championing it in that department. Our sustainability planner is maxed out, and she's really focusing a lot right now on active transportation. And I'm going to speak about that a bit more in a sec, but yeah, it's, if you have to keep being like a dog with a bone and going again and again. How are we doing with that? What's happening with that? How are we going to get there? Because even if it's in policy, you have to keep going after it. I wanted to speak a bit about rebranding, because there's definitely pushback when you just hammer about climate. Everybody gets sick of hearing it. Like, a lot of people are just like, yeah, I don't want to hear about climate. So we've been doing a bit of sneaky rebranding where instead of talking about climate, we talk about saving taxpayers money, because our sustainability planner happens to be a mathematician and she's really good at numbers, and she's phenomenal at life cycle costing and spelling out for the business people on our council the return on investment. Like, the mayor's eyes lit right up when she talked about ROI, and he was like looking at the table. Wait a minute, what the payback period is only 4.6 years? And so after that, it's going to be revenue. We're going to be making revenue, basically. It's like, yes, the first thing I circled at the top there, she looked at the hydro bills 1 month into her role and saw that the city was being charged $14,500 in a power factor charge because the surge protector was broken. So it was a $3,000 part, and she completely paid for itself in 1 minute. And so from now on, we're saving $14,500 every year just because she looked at the hydro bills, and it had been broken for like 10 years, I hate to say it, or 15 years. So it's like, with somebody not looking at those things, because local governments have too many moving parts and pieces. Like, if nobody's dedicated to look at that, you're losing money, is just flying out the window. So we like to talk about saving taxpayers money. We also like to talk about, it's not about climate, it's about safety and livable communities. So we also talk about saving children's lives and saving seniors. And like, we have seniors in mobility scooters riding right in the driving lane down our main street, which is crazy. So by reframing the conversation and going, listen, we need separate protected bike lanes, but we're not even always calling them bike lanes, mobility lanes, because mobility scooters, moms with strollers, walkers, bike, everything needs a protected space. So these are a couple of sketches that we've had done up by a consultant working with our sustainability planner on some projects to make this is one intersection up on near the airport that we got the funding for, we got the grant funding for. And this, the bottom pictures are actually our provincial highway. So we had to collaborate with the province, with MOTI, on getting permission to design a narrowing of the highway in one spot to put these, curbs to bring the pedestrians out closer, because right now you're blocked by there's cars parking there. So we were successful in getting grant funding for that too, because we just designed it and we applied for grant and they go, here you go, you got money. Another super lucky thing that we have had for a long time is a community forest. And I know not all local governments have community forests, and maybe they're not all run quite the same way as ours, but our community forest has always given back to the community. All the revenues from the community forest go back to the community. And in the last few years, they've recognized how important the climate action is and the greenhouse gas emission reductions for the city as a corporate entity. And they have been fantastic about supplying huge amounts of money towards upgrading our civic facilities, doing all these energy efficient projects, changing out boilers, doing heat pumps, like basically anything we sort of present to them that we had done in an engineering study that we made sure we looked at our civic facilities to see what could be done. They're supplying a big chunk of the money, and usually it's matching funds for other grants. And they also paid a huge, I think it was almost $2 million in my first term to purchase a park. So they purchased all the trees that were owned by Mosaic or Island Timberlands, purchased all the trees so that to save them from being logged. So we now have Millennium Park right in the middle of town, staying a beautiful park, and there's trails in there, and it's wonderful. And I just put a couple notes on there about community works funds are a way to fund your climate action projects, but it's now being changed to be called the Canada Community Building Fund. And then of course I mentioned the carrot funding, which I would highly recommend having council put that in a dedicated reserve if they're not already doing that. It's being changed as we speak. The province is coming out with a better fund. It's supposed to have more funding for local governments for climate action, and they're going to release that soon. And then just quickly to wrap things up, I can't say enough about Youth Council. Having the engagement of the youth, they're just chomping at the bit to be heard and be part of the solutions and not feel so, so afraid of the future. They want to be empowered. These are a few of our youth. They go and they sit in the chair. They alternate chairing the meetings, learning how to run meetings, learn all about government. And again, I had to take that on off the side of my third desk because that doesn't exist in the structure of local government as far as anything. So I would just create the agendas and I would do that bit of work, but it's been so fun. And our last go around, we had 24 applicants. So I just take them all. I don't, there's a process that you apply, but I just take them all. It's like, I don't reject anybody. Through every year when we had before COVID, the BC Youth Parliament, we had several accepted to BC Youth Parliament every year and go to Victoria, which they were just phenomenal at that as well. And of course, having them participate in things like the creation of the Parks and Trails Master Plan, the Bicycle Network Strategy, having all of those engagement sessions, including youth. And then they also reach out to their other friends and say, hey, you got to do the online survey. Hey, come to this meeting. No elected official will say no when you have a student come to a council or committee meeting and say, hey, council, we think this is a good idea. We think you need more bike lanes. We think you need this. Like, council cannot say no to that. So it's been super powerful and strong. Our youth council created a social media campaign, hashtag Why We Bike PR. And they were doing all these amazing shots of biking their bike around town and them biking around town. It was just amazing and also coincided a lot of times with Bike to Work and School Week. And they didn't know of Greta. When Greta first came on the scene, I brought it up at a youth council meeting and they hadn't heard of her yet because it was just right before she kind of went totally viral. And so they started organizing the Fridays for Future climate strikes at school. It was incredible. And even got, the principal all worked up. And then the second one they had was now supported by the school. So they've been really incredible. And I wish there was a way. I kind of want to write like a book, like a handbook for all local governments, because I've had lots of local governments reach out to me and say, how do I start a youth council? It's like, I just figured it out as we went, and I started by following the terms of reference from Edmonton had two amazing youth councils. So I kind of started there and just made it up as I went, but putting that power into the hands of our youth. I start out in elementary school. I go recruiting at elementary school, and I had these young ones writing letters on banning single-use plastics, and I handed all of their handwritten letters to Premier Horgan at our Association of Vancouver Island Coastal Communities, and he read all of them. He thought it was adorable, but we started changing the rules on we're getting rid of plastic pretty soon. So it's happening. And some of our students have gone on to do student films about the emergency break was actually done right before COVID, and they worked in Greta actually narrating. It's using her speech as the narrative, and the toxic footprint of bottled water was one that they did at their film school years ago. But it's another good one because it was a big topic at the time. So yeah, can't say enough about different ways that you can engage with the community and things that you can do locally. But I'm super impressed with Nanaimo's plan. So I hope I can sort of help in any way going forward. So there's my contact information. That's it. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Carol Ann. Wonderful presentation. And I loved how Deb looked at what we can do to mobilize the broader community, and you focused on how can we actually change the culture within our elected government. So I thought those two complemented each other very well. And you talked about the importance of engaging youth. Back in 2014, when I was living in Hamilton, I was involved in a project called the People's Platform, where we brought people together to say, well, before we elect our next council, let's decide what we want them to do. And we actually came up with 42, a whole bunch of ideas, and 47 were ultimately voted upon and approved. But one of the ideas that actually made it through and was adopted came from a 13-year-old who took part in that People's Platform process. And the person was just blown away that these adults were actually listening to what they had to offer. So it was really cool to see. And speaking of youth, there was a posting in the chat from Heather saying that there is a workshop tomorrow evening. If you look at it, the link is there on how, I'll have to scroll up here to find it, on how municipalities can more effectively engage with youth. And there was a note from Chris as well saying that the library actually has those infrared cameras available, and you can borrow it if you want to. So thank you, Chris, for letting us know that. Let's see, there was one question that I wanted to highlight. Let me just see if I can find it here as a question from Trent. Trent asked, what are the sources of revenue to the community forest that they can contribute to the community? So I guess that question is for you, Carol Ann.
They log, so they own plots of land that's all second growth, and so they harvest trees, but they do it in the most sustainable way they can. And they don't impact trails. They work with the local mountain biking groups that build trails, and the hiking groups as well. And they give back to those areas by, if they do go near any trails, they actually improve them. And then they also supply money for building cabins up in the backcountry. So we have the longest hut to hut hiking trail for a certain size community. And so they do log, but they also do it very sustainably and give back a lot to the community.
Okay, thank you. And that's the first time I've heard of a community forest. What a fabulous concept. So thank you for introducing us to that. And Shelley asked if you could put the slides in the chat. And if that's not possible, if you can send us a link, we can include them in the post workshop email that goes out to participants who registered. And I just wanted to share a comment from Patty, who says, Carol Ann, your incredible enthusiasm is contagious. I love that you have such a terrific sense of humor, having fun doing your job. I second that. Heather also says that the Climate Caucus is another really important organization for local elected officials across Canada working on this issue, for sharing
Climate
ideas
Caucus
and
actually
plans.
is the one that asked me to be here today. Another member of Climate Caucus, so I'm actually on Climate Caucus as well. Yeah.
Yes, great. All right. And I think, and Zenny says, we thought of a youth council, but then thought that we would encourage youth to be on all of our committees, from engagement to mobility and so on. Okay. Oh, and there was a question. Chris is asking a question to Zenny. I'm curious, do the youth on committee have a dedicated seat on the committees, or are they taking a space open to the public?
We actually had youth council members have a dedicated seat on our climate change mitigation adaptation committee for a while. But the youth council itself, they are their own council. So they felt that that was more impactful, coming to, you know, give recommendations to council as the youth council. Like, they felt that that was more impactful. They did participate, members did participate in climate committee for a while, but they would just make recommendations themselves based on the things the climate action committee was doing. They would just, you know, say, yeah, we want to see this or that, do their own actions. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. And how does it work for the city of Nanaimo, Zenny?
Well, right now, and I don't know if we reached 100%, but I think we did. I know on our environmental and our inclusivity, we have youth on both. I don't believe they were a dedicated seat, but I know that we reached out to high school and to VIU, and we worked closely with School District 68. So that's how we managed to. I think there's merit in both. I think a youth council does have a lot of merit too, but we were wanting to make sure that they were able to participate and have a voice in the issues that would be having direct feedback to the city in multiple areas rather than just one.
Okay, great. Thank you. So now we're actually going to give people a chance to meet up with either of our two presenters to talk about a couple of questions. Just going to post these in the chat. And the two questions that we're going to invite you to explore during the breakout groups, and we'll have 15 minutes for this, are: what are the best opportunities for Nanaimo to improve equity and quality of life while addressing the climate emergency? And second, what specific concrete actions would you like to see us promote to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions? And the link to the Jamboard has been posted there, where you can actually post your ideas. And we would ask that there be one person from each of the two groups to act as a scribe to report back to the group. So I'm going to ask if our Zoom genies in the background can send us into true breakout groups, and if you can then pause the recording until we come back into the main room. All right, well, welcome back to the main room, everyone. We hope you had a stimulating and exciting conversation in your breakout rooms. And we have a few minutes before we conclude, so I'm just going to ask if anyone has some really great ideas that emerged from your breakout room that you would like to share with the whole group today. And if you can just put up your hands so we know who has some ideas they would like to share. Did I say okay, Catherine? And you are muted, Catherine.
And I want to go to the Jamboard because I think the best ideas were there. Let's see. Abolish R1 zoning because that wastes land and makes public transit difficult. Have council pass a resolution to support a more environmentally friendly form of burial practices. And I'm not going to go into the details, but Dawn is your expert on that. Adopt form-based zoning, prohibit single-story retail spaces. Work with the Island Corridor Foundation to restore passenger rail. Form a community forest trust to purchase as much of our watershed as possible. Strongly encourage e-bike uptake. Require a bike rack minimums for retail parking lots and reduce car parking minimums. Support retrofits to adopt low carbon heating systems. Require white roofing material only, and develop zero waste policies. So those were some of the things. And then one of the more obvious ones, which was, let's support our green-minded counselors. The Nanaimo Climate Action Hub has been very successful because that's what they've done whenever there's been a particular resolution that needed public support. We've flooded council with emails and letters, and on the latest successful action, which was to get council to commit to low carbon energy systems, individual city councilors were lobbied, and background material was supplied. And I just think I'm talking about this because I think it's just so wonderful, because the vote was 6-2 and they managed even to change the mayor's mind, which is like a big deal. So
It is. Yeah, it is.
That's great. That's that mobilization that Deb was talking about. Yes.
absolutely.
And Francis, you want to share from your group?
Yeah, so I'm thinking we had quite a few really interesting ideas. One that really struck me, building on our first presentation today. She talked a lot about the importance of networking and a voice and involving people and participation. And I discovered there's such a thing as grants that you can get for that. And so I wondered, well, what do you do with a grant? And they said, well, in case of youth involvement, pay them to come and share their voice. And I think that could work for single moms at home too, to have a stipend to come and participate, might put food on the table or something else like that. It would definitely contribute to equity in two ways, if we could do something like that. I'm not remembering her name right off the bat, but she had a wonderful description of heat pumps. Not sure if I lost myself there for a second. Digging a well and then having a reservoir of water, a reservoir tank from that well, and putting her heat pump in that water. It's deep enough that it doesn't freeze in the winter, and she can do geothermal, not just air transfer, but geothermal. I don't know how many people might be able to do that, but I don't think that idea is being considered very much for people's homes, and I rather liked it. And there's something else. I have to keep going back to the Jamboards here. My computer keeps doing one or the other. Shelley suggested that we need a lot more of the connectivity stuff if the neighborhood associations are working with each other to find the best ideas among them that are working, and to spread, if you get a good idea, to spread it to other neighborhoods. To keep building the connectivity between the neighborhood groups, and encourage more participation in the neighborhood groups. There's a part, something about multi-unit strata and rental unit changes for heat pumps and car charging. We have to really put some emphasis into getting the multi-unit stratas having access to these things. And
Right.
more for active transportation, more investment in that. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Francis. And we are getting very near to the end of our time, but I see Trent, you have your hand up. So if you want to quickly share maybe one other idea that stood out for you.
No, I was just going to comment on the heat pump changes, or strata changes for heat pump. My parents, one of my sets of parents, their strata complex is getting air conditioners installed in all of their units because of the heat dome, and their bylaws prevent their local bylaws prevent them from getting heat pumps. They're getting air conditioners, but their bylaws prevent them from getting heat pumps. And they will not accept an air conditioner is a heat pump. Just get a different model as an answer because their
strata-
bylaws
That's
because
so
their bylaws
important.
prevent it.
You know,
Our
we really
strata
need a lot.
complex is getting some heat pumps. Some people in our strata complex, Trent.
You got
It
good
sounds like this
bylaws.
is the bylaws for this particular strata that are
Yeah,
the
it's
problem.
it's
Yes.
the Ocean Walk.
Okay.
It's the
Okay.
Ocean Walk on Uplands, and it's their bylaws specifically. And apparently, they did have one person on the bylaws who was not my stepdad, who I was grilling about it, and he was saying that by the time it becomes an issue, he'll be dead, which is the most boomer thing I've heard out of him.
We could ask Vizoa to run workshops on this to train the strata and how to do a bylaw that will allow heat pumps and why they should do it. They are now already running workshops on getting vehicle charging.
All right. Well, thank you for those ideas. Thank you for that comment, Trent. I do want to be mindful of our time. We did promise people we'd be finishing around 8:30 tonight. So I just want to say thank you to everyone who attended to our workshop tonight and for all of the wonderful ideas that have been shared in the breakout rooms. I also want to just remind everyone that we do have municipal elections coming up in the fall. So wherever you happen to live, share the word that there are elections and tell 5 other people to get out and vote for the greenest, most climate forward running representatives that you can find. We need climate champions on all of our municipal elected officials. So that would be my closing thought. So once again, thank you everyone for attending tonight. We
Thank
hope
you,
found it
Dawn.
informative. Thank you, Carol Ann. Thank you, Deb, for your wonderful presentations. And thank you to Heather and Chris, our Zoom genies behind the scenes, for all of your work and making everything run so smoothly. So thank you everyone for attending tonight and have a wonderful rest of the week.
Thank you. Thank you, Dawn.
Thank you.